An unassuming 70-year-old veteran in worn jeans and a faded military surplus jacket shuffles into an upscale martial arts dojo, asking about beginner classes. The head instructor, a cocky black belt covered in trophies and sponsorship patches, takes one look at the old man's weathered hands and slow gait and decides to make an example of him in front of his advanced students. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. What starts as cruel mockery about old-timers who watch too many movies escalates into a public challenge that the veteran quietly accepts. The black belt has no idea he's just challenged a decorated Special Forces veteran who spent decades mastering combat techniques the dojo instructor has never even heard of. What happened next left everyone speechless and changed the entire dojo forever. The elite Dragon Martial Arts Academy stood like a temple to physical perfection in the heart of Westfield's most exclusive shopping district. Its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing an interior that gleamed with polished hardwood floors and state-of-the-art training equipment that cost more than most people's cars. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting perfect light over rows of heavy bags wrapped in genuine leather. Olympic-grade mats imported from Japan, and mirrored walls that stretched endlessly to reflect the wealth and status of those who could afford the $500 monthly membership fees. Trophy cases lined the entrance hallway like golden monuments, each shelf meticulously arranged with gleaming awards, championship belts, and framed photographs of victories that spoke to years of dedication and success. At the center of this martial arts paradise stood Marcus Chen, the head instructor whose presence commanded the room with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His perfectly sculpted physique, showcased in a custom-tailored black uniform, emblazoned with his name in golden thread. Every muscle defined from years of disciplined training and competition. His dark hair was styled with precision, his posture radiating the kind of controlled power that came from knowing exactly how dangerous his hands and feet could be, and his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who had built an empire on his ability to break down opponents, both physically and mentally. The walls around his private office displayed his journey from promising young fighter to regional champion to nationally recognized martial arts celebrity. Each photograph showing him holding another trophy, shaking hands with another dignitary, or demonstrating techniques to crowds of admiring students who hung on his every word. When wealthy clients entered his domain, they didn't just see an instructor, but a living embodiment of what their money could buy them. A master who could transform their soft, comfortable lives into something powerful and respected. And Marcus knew exactly how to make them feel both privileged to be in his presence and desperate to earn his approval through higher-level classes, private sessions, and exclusive seminars that cost more than some people made in a month. Frank Morrison shuffled through the gleaming glass doors of the elite Dragon Martial Arts Academy like a man who had wandered into the wrong century, his 70-year-old frame carrying itself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place among the polished marble and crystal fixtures that surrounded him. His faded Levi's had seen better decades, worn soft at the knees and frayed at the cuffs from years of honest work, while his old military surplus jacket hung loosely on his lean shoulders, its olive drab fabric decorated with patches that had lost their vibrant colors to time and weather, but still bore the faint outlines of units and campaigns that spoke of service in distant places. Scuffed work boots that had walked through mud, sand, and in places most people only saw in movies, carried him across the expensive flooring with the measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that rushing rarely solved anything, each step deliberate and purposeful, despite the slight stiffness that came with decades of hard living. His graying beard, neatly trimmed but showing the silver of a man who had earned every one of those years, framed a face that bore the quiet lines of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand what truly mattered. While his weathered hands told stories in every scar, callus, an age spot that marked them as tools that had built things, fixed things, and when necessary, protected things. He approached the reception desk with the same careful politeness he had used in 1,000 different situations throughout his life, removing a worn baseball cap to reveal thinning hair as he waited patiently for the young woman behind the counter to finish her phone call his blue eyes taking in the opulent surroundings without judgment, but with the observant nature of someone trained to assess his environment. When she finally looked up, he spoke in a voice that carried the respectful tone of a man who had been taught that courtesy costs nothing but means everything, asking simply if they offered beginner classes for seniors, explaining that he had always been curious about martial arts and thought it might be good exercise for someone his age. His words delivered with the kind of genuine humility that came not from weakness, but from a lifetime of understanding that true strength never needed to announce itself. Sarah Martinez, the 24-year-old receptionist whose genuine warmth had made her a favorite among the Academy's members, smiled at Frank with the kind of authentic kindness that had nothing to do with membership fees or social status, her voice soft and encouraging as she began explaining the senior fitness programs they offered and how martial arts could indeed be excellent low-impact exercise for older adults. From across the main training floor, Marcus Chen's attention was drawn to the conversation like a predator sensing weakness, his eyes immediately cataloging every detail of Frank's appearance with the dismissive assessment of someone who had built his reputation on physical superiority and had no patience for what he saw as delusions of grandeur from people who should know better. These old guys living in Fantasyland, Marcus thought to himself as he watched Frank's weathered hands gesture politely, while Sarah pulled out brochures, probably watched too many Bruce Lee movies back in the day and now think they can come in here and play pretend warrior at 70 years old, completely clueless about what real martial arts training actually demands from the human body. The sight of Frank's surplus jacket and work boots triggered every prejudice Marcus had carefully cultivated about people who didn't belong in his world of elite athletes and wealthy professionals, his internal monologue becoming increasingly contemptuous as he imagined this old man stumbling through basic stretches while his serious students tried to focus on advanced techniques. Unable to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority while simultaneously protecting what he saw as the integrity of his academy, Marcus strode over to the reception desk with the confident swagger of a man who had never been challenged in his own domain, his perfectly pressed uniform and championship rings catching the light as he positioned himself between Sarah and Frank with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Excuse me," Marcus interrupted with the kind of patronizing tone reserved for children and people he considered beneath his notice, "but I couldn't help overhearing, and I have to ask if you've really thought this through." "Sir, because martial arts training is extremely demanding physically, and at your age, well, there are certainly safer activities that might be more appropriate for someone in your condition. Perhaps something less likely to result in injury or disappointment." Sarah Martinez, the 24-year-old receptionist whose genuine warmth had made her a favorite among the Academy's members, smiled at Frank with the kind of authentic kindness that had nothing to do with membership fees or social status, her voice soft and encouraging as she began explaining the senior fitness programs they offered and how martial arts could indeed be excellent low-impact exercise for older adults. From across the main training floor, Marcus Chen's attention was drawn to the conversation like a predator sensing weakness, his eyes immediately cataloging every detail of Frank's appearance with the dismissive assessment of someone who had built his reputation on physical superiority and had no patience for what he saw as delusions of grandeur from people who should know better. These old guys living in Fantasyland, Marcus thought to himself as he watched Frank's weathered hands gesture politely while Sarah pulled out brochures, probably watched too many Bruce Lee movies back in the day and now think they can come in here and play pretend warrior at 70 years old, completely clueless about what real martial arts training actually demands from the human body. The sight of Frank's surplus jacket and work boots triggered every prejudice Marcus had carefully cultivated about people who didn't belong in his world of elite athletes and wealthy professionals, his internal monologue becoming increasingly contemptuous as he imagined this old man stumbling through basic stretches while his serious students tried to focus on advanced techniques. Unable to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority while simultaneously protecting what he saw as the integrity of his academy, Marcus strode over to the reception desk with the confident swagger of a man who had never been challenged in his own domain, in his perfectly pressed uniform and championship rings catching the light as he positioned himself between Sarah and Frank with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Excuse me," Marcus interrupted with a kind of patronizing tone reserved for children and people he considered beneath his notice. But I couldn't help overhearing. And I have to ask if you've really thought this through, sir. Because martial arts training is extremely demanding physically. And at your age, well, there are certainly safer activities that might be more appropriate for someone in your condition. Perhaps something less likely to result in injury or disappointment. Marcus's eyes lit up with the cruel inspiration of someone who had found the perfect way to cement his dominance while providing entertainment for his paying customers, his voice taking on the mock-helpful tone of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student as he clapped his hands together to gather everyone's attention. You know what, folks? I think this is actually a perfect opportunity for a little demonstration, he announced to his assembled students, his gesture encompassing both Frank and the training mats with theatrical flourish. Because our friend here seems genuinely interested in martial arts, and I think it would be educational for everyone to see what real training looks like versus what people imagine it to be from watching movies. Frank's weathered face remained impassive, but those who knew how to read the subtle signs of a man under pressure might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders that spoke to decades of military bearing, asserting itself despite his desire to avoid conflict. That's very kind of you to offer, Frank replied with the same polite tone he had maintained throughout the conversation, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone choosing his words carefully. But I really just came in to ask about beginner classes, and I wouldn't want to take up your students' valuable training time with something like that. But Marcus had tasted blood in the water and had no intention of letting his prey escape so easily, his predatory instincts fully engaged as he sensed weakness in Frank's reluctance to engage, completely misunderstanding that what he saw as fear was actually the discipline of a man who had learned through hard experience that violence should always be the last resort. Every fiber of Frank's being, honed through decades of military training and combat experience, screamed at him to de-escalate, to walk away, to avoid the unnecessary confrontation that his gut told him would end badly for everyone involved. But the attack on his dignity in front of these strangers was beginning to override his better judgment in ways that reminded him of younger, angrier days when respect had to be earned through demonstration rather than age and experience. "Oh, come on. It'll be fun and educational," Marcus pressed, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Just a few basic moves, and nothing too strenuous. Think of it as a free introductory lesson that might help you decide if this is really something you want to pursue." Marcus turned away from Frank with the confident swagger of a showman who had found his perfect prop, his voice carrying across the academy as he called out to the other instructors and advanced students scattered throughout the facility. "Hey everyone, come over here for a minute. I want to show you all something really important about managing expectations and understanding what real martial arts training actually requires." The response was immediate, with black belts emerging from private lesson rooms, advanced students abandoning their practice routines, and even some of the academy's part-time instructors gathering around the reception area with the eager anticipation of people who had learned to treat their master's demonstrations as must-see events. "This gentleman here," Marcus continued, gesturing toward Frank with the patronizing smile of someone introducing a curiosity at a sideshow, "represents something we see all too often in this business. The unrealistic expectations that people develop from watching too many action movies and thinking that martial arts is something you can just walk into and master, regardless of age, physical condition, or natural ability." Frank stood in the center of the growing circle, with the stillness of a man who had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to aggression was simply to endure it with dignity, his hands hanging loosely at his sides while his blue eyes surveyed the faces around him with the calm assessment of someone taking the measure of potential threats. Sarah noticed it first, the subtle transformation that seemed to occur as Frank found himself surrounded and evaluated. The way his spine straightened almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring with the unconscious precision of someone who had stood at attention in front of superior officers, his breathing becoming deeper and more controlled as decades of military bearing asserted itself against the civilian casualness he had worn into the building. One of the senior students, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had been training seriously for over a decade, caught the change as well. Her experience with various martial arts backgrounds making her sensitive to the signs of someone who carried himself like a warrior, even when dressed like a retiree. But Marcus, drunk on his own performance and the rapt attention of his audience, remained completely oblivious to the subtle signs that should have warned him he was dealing with something far more dangerous than an aging dreamer. His focus entirely on the theater of the moment, rather than the reality of the man standing quietly before him, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that all storms eventually pass. The circle of onlookers had grown to include nearly everyone in the academy, their faces displaying a mixture of anticipation and uncomfortable awareness that what had started as their instructor's casual mockery was escalating into something more serious. While Marcus basked in the attention with the supreme confidence of a performer who had never had an audience walk away disappointed. "So, here's what we're going to do," Marcus announced with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to having his suggestions treated as commands. "I'm going to give our friend here a very gentle lesson in basic self-defense. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to show everyone the difference between fantasy and reality when it comes to martial arts training." Frank's weathered face remained calm, but those watching closely could see the slight tension that had entered his jaw. The way his breathing had become more deliberate as he recognized that the situation was moving beyond mere verbal humiliation into territory that his decades of experience told him would end badly for everyone involved. "Look, son," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful but firm tone of someone trying one last time to prevent an unnecessary confrontation. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm really not looking for any trouble here. I just wanted to ask about classes, and maybe I should come back another time when things aren't so busy." But Marcus, interpreting Frank's reluctance as confirmation of his own superiority and the old man's weakness, pressed forward with the relentless cruelty of someone who had never learned when to stop, his voice taking on a mocking edge that carried clearly across the silent training floor. "Oh, come on now. Don't tell me you're backing down already," Marcus taunted, his tone dripping with false concern, while his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had completely dominated his opponent without even throwing a punch. "I mean, what kind of man walks into a martial arts academy talking about training and then runs away the moment someone offers to show him what it's really about? Surely you're not going to let a little friendly demonstration hurt your pride." The words hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored, the questioning of Frank's manhood delivered with surgical precision in front of an audience of strangers, and those who understood the psychology of military men could see the exact moment when Frank's patience finally reached its limit, his blue eyes hardening with the cold resolve of someone who had been pushed one step too far. The silence that followed Marcus's challenge stretched for what felt like an eternity, every person in the circle holding their breath as they waited to see how the weathered old man would respond to having his courage questioned so publicly and deliberately, while Frank himself stood motionless in the center of their attention with the stillness of someone weighing consequences that went far beyond what anyone else in the room could possibly understand. Frank said finally, his voice carrying a quiet finality that seemed to resonate differently than anything he had said before, the words emerging with the controlled precision of someone who had made a decision he knew he would have to live with. "If you really think this is necessary, then I suppose we can do a little demonstration, but I'd like your word that this stays friendly and controlled, just basic techniques, nothing that's going to hurt anybody." The transformation that occurred in Frank's bearing was so subtle that most of the assembled students missed it entirely, their attention focused on Marcus's triumphant grin rather than the way their reluctant participant's spine had straightened with military precision, his shoulders squaring in a way that made him seem somehow larger despite his modest frame, his weathered hands falling to his sides with the relaxed readiness of someone whose muscle memory was beginning to override his conscious desire for peace. Sarah watched from behind the reception desk with growing unease as she noticed details that everyone else seemed to be missing. The way Frank's breathing had become deeper and more rhythmic, the subtle shift in his stance that transformed him from an awkward visitor into something that looked unexpectedly stable and grounded, the quiet confidence that had replaced the polite uncertainty he had shown throughout the conversation. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The slight tremor of nervousness completely gone as he asked, "Where would you like to do this? And what exactly did you have in mind?" But Marcus, intoxicated by what he saw as complete victory over an opponent who had finally been forced to submit to his will, remained utterly oblivious to the change that had occurred in the man standing before him, his focus entirely on the spectacle he was about to create rather than the reality of what he might actually be facing, his confidence absolute and his awareness of danger completely absent, as he began moving toward the main training mat with the swagger of someone who had never encountered a fight he couldn't win. Marcus bounded onto the main training mat with the theatrical flair of someone who had turned every sparring session into a performance, his movements fluid and exaggerated as he began an elaborate stretching routine, designed as much to intimidate his opponent as to prepare his body for action. His legs extending into perfect splits, while his arms moved through complex warm-up sequences that showcased the kind of flexibility that took years of dedicated training to achieve. The assembled students watched their instructor's display with the familiar appreciation of people who had seen this routine countless times before, their murmurs of admiration filling the air as Marcus transitioned seamlessly from one impressive stretch to another, his designer uniform highlighting every perfectly defined muscle as he prepared for what he clearly expected to be a brief and conclusive demonstration of his superiority. Frank's preparation, by contrast, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, the old man moving to the edge of the mat with unhurried steps before carefully removing his worn military surplus jacket and folding it with the precise movements of someone who had been taught that taking care of your equipment was a matter of survival rather than preference. As the jacket came away from his shoulders, several of the more observant students found themselves reassessing their initial impressions, their eyes widening slightly as they took in the lean but surprisingly muscular frame that had been hidden beneath the loose-fitting fabric, his arms and chest showing the kind of functional strength that came from decades of physical labor rather than gymnasium vanity. The soft metallic clink of dog tags catching the overhead lights drew immediate attention from those closest to the mat, the distinctive sound triggering recognition in anyone who had ever served or known someone who had, while the revelation of Frank's forearms told an even more compelling story to those who knew how to read the signs. Old scars crisscrossed the weathered skin in patterns that spoke of violence survived rather than accidents endured. Some thin and precise like knife wounds, others broader and more jagged like fragments from explosions, each mark a testament to experiences that no amount of dojo training could replicate or prepare someone for. And the few students who caught sight of these details began exchanging uncertain glances as they wondered what exactly their confident instructor was about to face. Marcus opened the demonstration with all the theatrical flair that had made him a favorite at martial arts tournaments, his body exploding into motion with a series of high kicks and spinning techniques that drew appreciative gasps from his audience. Each movement perfectly executed with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of practice and an absolute confidence in his own abilities. His legs whipped through the air in elaborate combinations, roundhouse kicks flowing seamlessly into spinning back kicks and then into jumping techniques that showcased not just his skill, but his athletic prowess. The crisp snapping sounds of his uniform cutting through the air, providing a rhythmic soundtrack to his display of dominance. Frank's response was so understated that it almost seemed like he wasn't responding at all. His weathered body moving with an economy of motion that made each of Marcus's flashy attacks look wasteful by comparison. His feet shifting just enough to take him out of the path of danger, while his upper body remained relaxed and centered, never moving more than absolutely necessary to avoid the techniques flying toward him. Where Marcus spun and leaped and kicked with explosive power, Frank simply stepped and slipped and angled his body with the minimal adjustments of someone who understood that the least movement required was always the best movement, on his footwork so subtle that casual observers might have missed it entirely, but those with trained eyes began to notice the mathematical precision with which he positioned himself always just beyond the reach of Marcus's most dangerous techniques. Marcus, interpreting Frank's defensive approach as proof that the old man was overwhelmed and unable to mount any kind of offensive response, began to push harder and throw more aggressive combinations, his confidence growing with each successful technique that seemed to force Frank to retreat or evade, and completely missing the fact that every one of his attacks was being neutralized with what appeared to be almost no effort at all. The crowd watched with the fascination of people witnessing what they believed was a masterful demonstration of skill versus inexperience, most of them sharing Marcus's interpretation that Frank was simply trying to survive long enough to escape with some shred of dignity intact, and aware that they were actually watching a masterclass in defensive positioning and distance management being delivered by someone whose understanding of violence went far beyond anything they had ever encountered in their comfortable world of rules and referees and protective equipment. The demonstration began to shift from playful exhibition to something more dangerous as Marcus, frustrated by his inability to land a clean technique on his seemingly defenseless opponent, started throwing his kicks and punches with increasing force and decreasing control. His breathing becoming labored, while sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned comfort of the academy. What had started as calculated techniques designed to impress his audience was evolving into something raw and more aggressive. His spinning kicks coming closer to Frank's head with each attempt, his punches carrying the kind of power that could cause serious injury if they connected with an unprepared target, and his footwork becoming less precise as emotion began to override the technical discipline that had made him a champion. Frank's concern was becoming increasingly evident to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs of a man evaluating a deteriorating tactical situation, his blue eyes tracking not just Marcus's movements, but also the proximity of the spectators who had crowded closer to get a better view, his peripheral awareness cataloging potential hazards like the trophy cases and equipment racks that could become dangerous if the confrontation expanded beyond the confines of the training mat. The old man's defensive movements were becoming more fluid with each passing moment, decades of muscle memory asserting themselves as his body remembered. Lessons learned in places where mistakes meant death rather than embarrassment. His hands beginning to move with a kind of automatic precision that came from training so deeply ingrained it had become instinctual rather than conscious. Where his initial evasions had been deliberate and measured, his current responses flowed like water around stone, each slip and deflection requiring no thought or planning as his nervous system took over from his conscious mind, transforming him from a polite senior citizen into something that moved with the deadly efficiency of a predator that had simply been choosing not to hunt. The spectators, still caught up in the excitement of what they believed was their instructor's domination of an overmatched opponent, remained oblivious to the growing danger in the room, their cheers and encouragement pushing Marcus toward increasingly reckless behavior, while Frank's expression grew more grim as he realized that the young man's ego and lack of real combat experience were creating a situation that could spiral completely out of control at any moment. Marcus gathered himself for what he clearly intended to be the grand finale of his demonstration, his chest heaving from exertion as he positioned himself at the perfect distance for his signature technique, the complex spinning kick combination that had won him 3 regional championships and never failed to leave his students speechless with admiration. The move required perfect timing and absolute commitment, beginning with a feint to draw his opponent's attention, flowing into a spinning back kick to create distance, and culminating in a devastating tornado kick that generated enough power to break boards or knock out an opponent. And Marcus threw himself into the technique with every ounce of skill and athleticism he possessed. Frank's weathered face remained impassive as he watched Marcus begin the familiar sequence, his decades of combat experience allowing him to read the technique's progression like a book he had studied countless times before. Recognizing the exact moment when Marcus would be most vulnerable, most committed to his attack, most unable to defend himself or change direction. As Marcus spun through the air in the final phase of his signature move, his body extended and rotating with tournament-winning precision, Frank stepped forward with the kind of simple, economical movement that spoke to a lifetime of understanding that the most effective techniques were often the most basic ones. His weathered right hand moving in a short, precise arc that intercepted Marcus's spinning form at exactly the right angle and exactly the right moment. The contact was so brief and seemed so minimal that many of the spectators missed it entirely. But the result was immediate and devastating, as Marcus's perfect technique collapsed into chaos, his body crumpling to the mat with a heavy thud that echoed through the suddenly silent academy like a gunshot. The complete absence of sound that followed was more shocking than any scream could have been. 30 people collectively holding their breath as they tried to process what they had just witnessed, their champion lying motionless on the training mat, while the unassuming old man stood over him with the calm expression of someone who had done exactly what needed to be done and nothing more. His breathing still steady and controlled, while Marcus groaned softly and tried to understand why the world had suddenly turned upside down around him. Frank immediately dropped to one knee beside Marcus with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with injured comrades in far more dangerous circumstances, his weathered hands moving with gentle precision as he checked the younger man's pupils for signs of concussion and felt along his neck and spine for any indication of serious injury, his voice soft and reassuring as he asked, "Can you hear me, son? Can you tell me your name and where you are right now?" The genuine concern in Frank's tone was unmistakable, his focus entirely on Marcus's well-being rather than any sense of triumph or vindication. And as he helped the dazed instructor slowly sit up and then carefully stand, several students found themselves reassessing everything they thought they knew about what had just happened. It was Tommy Chen, one of Marcus's teenage students, who first noticed the military surplus jacket lying forgotten on the floor beside the mat, his curiosity drawing him closer until he could make out the details of the patches sewn onto the faded fabric, his sharp intake of breath audible in the continued silence as he read the insignia that told a story none of them had expected. "Holy crap," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed academy as he pointed at the jacket. "Look at these patches. Special Forces, Airborne, Ranger tabs. And is that a Purple Heart?" The revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd as other students crowded around to see for themselves, their eyes widening as they took in the collection of military decorations that spoke to a level of service and sacrifice that existed in a completely different universe from their world of tournaments and trophies. Behind the reception desk, Sarah had pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, her thumbs flying across the screen as she typed "Frank Morrison Veteran Special Forces" into the search engine, her face growing pale as the results loaded, and she found herself staring at information that made her stomach drop with the realization of what Marcus had unknowingly challenged. "Oh my God," she breathed, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying to the nearest students who immediately turned their attention to her. Frank Morrison, Medal of Honor recipient, 32 years military service, including 15 years as a Special Forces instructor, responsible for training elite units in hand-to-hand combat and advanced tactical operations. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Afghanistan. Decorated veteran who later became one of the military's premier hand-to-hand combat specialists. Sarah's voice cut through the stunned silence with the trembling clarity of someone delivering news that would forever change how everyone in the room understood what they had just witnessed. Her phone screen glowing as she read from the search results that had appeared like a revelation from another world entirely. "Frank Morrison," she announced to the gathering crowd, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth as students abandoned their positions around Marcus to cluster near the reception desk. "Medal of Honor recipient for extraordinary heroism in Vietnam, where he single-handedly held off an enemy assault that saved his entire platoon. 32 years of military service, including multiple combat tours, and then spent 15 additional years as a Special Forces instructor at Fort Bragg, where he was responsible for training some of the most elite soldiers in the world in advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques and close-quarters battle tactics." The revelation hit the assembled students like a physical blow, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, awe, and dawning comprehension as they began to understand that they hadn't just witnessed a lucky punch or a fluke accident, but rather a masterclass in combat effectiveness delivered by someone whose credentials in violence were so far beyond their civilian understanding that they might as well have been watching a legend step out of the history books. "According to this," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as more details loaded on her screen, "he's credited with developing several hand-to-hand combat techniques that are still taught to special operations forces today. And after his retirement from active duty, he continued working as a civilian contractor, training Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and other special forces units until just 5 years ago when he finally retired at age 65. The students found themselves staring at Frank with completely new eyes, seeing past the faded jeans and weathered appearance to recognize something they had been too blind to notice before: the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death so many times that a martial arts demonstration barely registered as conflict worth his attention. Marcus, still shaky but now fully conscious, looked up at Frank from his position on the mat with an expression that mixed humiliation with growing awareness of just how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation. While around them, the academy buzzed with the electric energy of people who realized they had just witnessed something that would become the story they told for the rest of their lives. Marcus remained seated on the training mat, his face cycling through a spectrum of emotions as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him like a collapsing building. His usual confidence completely shattered as he realized that he had just publicly challenged and been effortlessly defeated by a genuine military legend whose credentials made his own tournament victories seem like children's games. In comparison, the humiliation was complete and devastating, his reputation as an unbeatable master crumbling before the eyes of every student who had looked up to him, paid premium prices to train under him, and believed in his supposed invincibility, while the fear that followed close behind came from the dawning awareness that Frank could have seriously injured or even killed him at any point during their brief encounter, but had chosen not to. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible as he struggled to find words adequate for the magnitude of his mistake. "I had no idea. I never should have. I thought you were just some old guy who watched too many movies, and I wanted to teach you a lesson about reality. But it turns out I was the one who didn't understand reality at all." But instead of the anger or contempt that Marcus expected and probably deserved, Frank's weathered face showed only the kind of patient understanding that came from decades of teaching young soldiers who thought they knew more than they actually did. His voice gentle but firm as he extended a hand to help Marcus fully to his feet. "Son, you've got solid basic technique and good flexibility, and I can see you've put a lot of work into your training," Frank said with the same respectful tone he had used throughout the evening, his words carrying no trace of mockery or superiority despite his overwhelming victory. But tournament fighting and real combat are two completely different animals, and the biggest difference isn't in the techniques themselves, but in understanding when and how to use them. The unexpected kindness in Frank's voice began to work on Marcus like medicine on a wound, and his shame and fear slowly being replaced by a desperate hunger to understand what he had been missing. What gaps in his knowledge had made him so vulnerable to someone he had dismissed as harmless? "Everything you did tonight was technically correct," Frank continued, his hand resting briefly on Marcus's shoulder with the gentle authority of a teacher rather than a conqueror. "But you were fighting for show instead of for effect. And in real situations, the person who survives isn't necessarily the one with the fanciest techniques, but the one who understands distance, timing, and how to end things quickly before they get out of control." The transformation of the academy's atmosphere was immediate and profound, as Frank found himself surrounded by eager faces, students who had arrived expecting routine training, but were now witnessing something they had never encountered in their years of martial arts study. Their questions tumbling over each other in their excitement to learn from someone whose knowledge had been forged in the crucible of actual life and death combat. The biggest difference between what you learn in competition and what you need in real situations, Frank explained, with the patient clarity of someone who had spent decades teaching complex concepts to young minds, is that sport fighting is about scoring points and looking good while staying within rules, but real combat is about ending threats as quickly and efficiently as possible so you can go home to your family. His weathered hands moved with precise economy as he demonstrated the principles he was describing, showing how every movement in military combat was designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. His footwork positioning him for escape routes while his hand positions prepared him for both offensive and defensive options, and his entire body, maintaining the kind of constant awareness that treated every person and object in the room as potential factors in an ongoing tactical equation. Watch how different this is from what you saw earlier, Frank continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute experience as he moved through a series of basic techniques that looked nothing like the flashy combinations Marcus had been throwing, each motion stripped down to its essential elements with no wasted energy or unnecessary flourishes. In the military, we call it economy of force, using exactly as much violence as necessary to solve the problem and no more. Because every second you spend on fancy moves is a second when something can go wrong. Marcus hung on every word with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview had been turned upside down in the span of 10 minutes. His former arrogance completely replaced by genuine curiosity and a desperate hunger to understand the gaps in his knowledge that had made him so vulnerable to someone he had catastrophically underestimated. Situational awareness is everything, Frank explained, as he demonstrated how his positioning allowed him to monitor the entire room while seemingly focused on his demonstration, because the fight you can see coming is almost always easier to handle than the one that catches you by surprise. And in real situations, there are no referees to make sure everyone follows the rules or to stop things when someone gets hurt. The bombardment of requests began almost before Frank had finished his impromptu lesson, students pressing forward with the desperate enthusiasm of people who had suddenly realized they had been learning only half of what they thought they knew. Their voices overlapping as they begged him to stay and to teach regular classes, to share the knowledge that had made their supposedly invincible instructor look like an amateur in the span of a single technique. "Please, you have to become an instructor here," pleaded Jennifer Walsh, one of the senior black belts whose eyes still held the shock of watching everything she thought she understood about martial arts get turned upside down. "We've been training for years, but we've never seen anything like what you just showed us, and we need to learn this stuff. The real stuff, not just the tournament techniques." The chorus of agreement that followed her plea was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of voices joining together in a desperate attempt to convince Frank that they deserved access to the kind of knowledge that money couldn't buy and tournaments couldn't teach. But Frank's weathered face showed the patient understanding of someone who had fielded similar requests countless times throughout his long career. But it was Marcus who surprised everyone, including himself, when he stepped forward with the humility of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered by a single moment of truth, his voice steady despite the visible effort it took him to set aside his pride and ask for help from the man who had just exposed the limitations of everything he thought he knew. "Frank," Marcus said, his use of the older man's first name carrying a respect that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "I know I have no right to ask this after the way I treated you, but would you consider teaching me? Really teaching me? Not just the techniques, but the understanding behind them. Because I realize now that I've been playing at being a martial artist without actually understanding what that means." Frank's response came with the measured wisdom of someone who had spent decades turning young soldiers' mistakes into learning opportunities rather than career-ending disasters, his voice carrying the firm but compassionate tone of a teacher who understood that true strength came from building people up rather than tearing them down. "Son, what happened here tonight wasn't about me being better than you," Frank said, his weathered hand once again finding Marcus's shoulder with the gentle authority of a mentor rather than a conqueror. "It was about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between technique and understanding. And the most important thing I can teach any of you is that real martial arts isn't about proving how tough you are, but about having the confidence to walk away from fights you don't need to have, and the ability to end quickly the ones you can't avoid." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything the elite Dragon Martial Arts Academy had ever witnessed, as Frank's conditions for teaching revealed the fundamental difference between his approach and everything the students had previously experienced, his weathered voice laying out requirements that had nothing to do with belt rankings or tournament victories, and everything to do with character and genuine understanding. "I'll teach 2 classes a week," Frank said with the firm tone of someone who had learned that clear boundaries were essential for effective instruction. "But they won't be about learning new techniques or preparing for competitions. They'll be about understanding the responsibility that comes with knowing how to hurt people and the wisdom to know when you shouldn't." The transformation in Marcus was immediate and profound. His former swagger replaced by the eager attention of someone who had discovered that everything he thought he knew was merely the beginning of a much deeper and more complex subject. His questions revealing a genuine hunger to understand not just what Frank could teach him, but why those lessons mattered in ways that extended far beyond physical technique. "I want to learn everything," Marcus said with the humility of someone whose arrogance had been surgically removed by reality. Not just the fighting techniques, but the philosophy behind them. The discipline, the way you carry yourself, the way you handled this whole situation with kindness instead of cruelty, even though you could have destroyed me completely. Frank's response came with the patient smile of someone who had seen this transformation many times before in young soldiers who had been forced to confront the difference between bravado and genuine confidence. His acceptance of Marcus as a student, carrying conditions that would reshape not just the instructor, but the entire culture of the academy. The changes began immediately, with students who had previously focused entirely on perfecting their tournament forms, suddenly asking questions about situational awareness and de-escalation techniques, their conversations shifting from comparisons of their latest belt promotions to discussions of responsibility and the ethical implications of their training. Even the physical space of the academy seemed different, and the trophy cases and championship photographs taking on a different meaning, as students began to understand that true mastery wasn't measured by the hardware on the walls, but by the character of the person wearing the uniform. And Marcus found himself looking at his own accomplishments with new eyes that saw them as the beginning of his education rather than the culmination of it. 3 months later, the elite Dragon Martial Arts Academy bore only a superficial resemblance to the ego-driven proving ground it had been before Frank Morrison walked through its doors. The physical space unchanged, but the entire atmosphere transformed by principles that had nothing to do with trophies and everything to do with character. Marcus Chen moved through his classes with a quiet confidence that had replaced his former swagger, his instructions focusing on precision and control rather than flashy combinations, his voice carrying the respectful authority of someone who had learned that true leadership came from building others up rather than demonstrating his own superiority at their expense. The students themselves reflected this transformation in countless small ways, their interactions marked by genuine support and encouragement, rather than the competitive backbiting that had previously characterized the academy's culture. And senior students now spending their time helping beginners find their footing, rather than showing off their advanced techniques to impress onlookers. Frank's Tuesday and Thursday evening classes had developed a waiting list that stretched 6 months into the future, with people driving from neighboring states to attend sessions that bore no resemblance to traditional martial arts instruction. Focusing instead on situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and the kind of practical self-defense that prioritized getting home safely over looking impressive. The changes extended far beyond the training floor, with Marcus implementing new policies that emphasized character development alongside physical technique, requiring students to demonstrate not just technical proficiency, but also emotional maturity and respect for others before advancing in rank, transforming the academy from a place where people paid to learn how to fight into a community where they came to understand what it meant to be strong. Even the trophy cases had been reorganized to include recognition for acts of kindness, mentorship, and community service alongside the traditional competition awards, while the walls now featured photos of students helping at local charity events and community outreach programs that had become integral parts of the academy's mission. Sarah often found herself watching Frank work with his students, marveling at how the unassuming old man in faded jeans had accomplished what years of expensive marketing and flashy promotions had failed to achieve, creating an environment where people genuinely wanted to become better versions of themselves rather than simply more effective fighters. And she understood now that she had witnessed something far more significant than a martial arts demonstration that night 3 months ago. As Frank Morrison folded his worn military surplus jacket and prepared to leave the academy after another evening of teaching students who hung on his every word with the reverence typically reserved for genuine heroes, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from that humiliating confrontation 3 months ago to this moment of quiet satisfaction, understanding that the most important lesson he had taught wasn't about combat techniques or self-defense, but about the fundamental truth that strength without character was merely brutality, dressed up in fancy uniforms and impressive credentials. The transformation he had witnessed in Marcus and the students wasn't really about martial arts at all, but about the recognition that true power came from the ability to lift others up rather than tear them down, to choose compassion over cruelty, even when you possess the skills to dominate completely, and to understand that the most significant victories were won not through superior technique, but through the wisdom to know when fighting wasn't the answer and the courage to choose a better path. He had watched Marcus evolve from an arrogant instructor who measured his worth by his ability to humiliate others into a leader who understood that his real job was helping people discover their own strength and potential, while the students had learned that respect wasn't something you demanded through intimidation, but something you earned through consistency, kindness, and genuine concern for the well-being of others. The greatest irony of that night 3 months ago, Frank realized, was that everyone in the room had been so focused on appearances and assumptions that they had nearly missed the opportunity to learn something valuable. Their preconceptions about age and clothing and social status, blinding them to the possibility that wisdom often came in unexpected packages and from unexpected sources. As he pushed through the gleaming glass doors into the cool evening air, Frank smiled at the thought that his simple desire to try something new in his retirement had accidentally become a reminder that the people we dismiss most quickly are often the ones who have the most to teach us, if only we have the humility to listen and the wisdom to look beyond the surface to see the character that truly defines a person's worth. The lesson that would echo through the academy long after his classes ended wasn't about fighting or self-defense, but about the transformative power of approaching others with respect and openness rather than judgment, because in a world that constantly encouraged people to make snap decisions based on appearances, the courage to withhold judgment and seek understanding was perhaps the most radical act of all.